The stale air of the great hall tasted of fear and spiced wine. It was a scent Alara knew intimately, the metallic tang of anxiety clinging to the back of her throat like a burr. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the worn leather of her boots as she moved between tables, refilling goblets, with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. To show weakness here, in the heart of the Shadowfang Pack's territory, was to invite cruelty. And she had borne enough of Alpha Vorlag's cruelty to last a dozen lifetimes. Tonight was worse. Tonight, the air was thick with a power that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. It was an ancient, predatory stillness that dwarfed Vorlag's brutish authority, making him seem like a yapping cur in the presence of a lion. The Alpha King had come. Kale of the Blood Moon dynasty. His name was a whispered legend, a threat and a promise. He and his twin brother, Rhys, ruled the unified territories with an iron grip that had brought a century of peace. Alara stole a glance at the high table, a foolish, dangerous impulse. He was exactly as the terrified whispers described, a monolith of a man, carved from granite and fury. His dark hair was tied back from a face of sharp angles and imperial arrogance. He wasn't speaking, merely listening to Vorlag's booming sycophancy, his gaze sweeping the hall with an unnerving, predatory focus. A low growl rumbled through the floorboards, and Alara flinched, her gaze snapping back to the flagstones. It was him. A warning. She was an Omega, and a servant. She was not meant to look upon a king. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She focused on the task, her movements becoming smaller, more precise. Refill the wine. Clear the plates. Do not be seen. Do not be noticed. The scent of him was overwhelming, even from across the room. It was ozone after a lightning strike, ancient forest floor, and something else, something that called to a hollow, aching part of her she didn't know existed. It made the faint, crescent-shaped scar high on her collarbone tingle with a strange, phantom heat. She'd had the mark for as long as she could remember, a pale, silvery line against her skin that no one had ever been able to explain. A crash shattered the tense quiet. A serving boy, younger than her and twice as clumsy, had dropped a platter of roasted boar. Vorlag's head whipped around, his face contorting into a mask of rage. Alara's breath hitched. She knew what was coming. The boy froze, his eyes wide with terror. Useless, Vorlag snarled, his voice a low thunder that promised violence. He started to rise from his seat. Before Alara could think, her body moved. It was a stupid, suicidal instinct. She darted forward, kneeling beside the trembling boy and beginning to gather the scattered pieces of meat. "My apologies, Alpha," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "It was my fault. I bumped into him." The lie was thin as spider silk, but it was all she had. She could take the punishment better than the boy could. Her skin was a road map of old bruises, one more wouldn't make a difference. Silence descended. It was heavier, more suffocating than the noise had been. She could feel every eye in the hall on her, but one gaze burned hotter than all the rest. She risked a glance up, through the curtain of her tangled brown hair. The Alpha King was looking directly at her. His eyes, the color of molten gold, weren't filled with the contempt she expected. They were narrowed, filled with a shocking, piercing intensity. It felt as if he could see straight through her skin, down to the frantic, terrified beat of her heart. "Leave it," a voice commanded. The sound vibrated through her bones, a deep baritone that resonated with absolute power. It was the king. Vorlag, who had been about to lunge, froze. "Your Majesty." "I said, leave it," Kale repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He pushed his chair back and stood, the movement fluid and utterly menacing. The hall seemed to shrink around him. The girl was trying to prevent a scene. A commendable display of loyalty to her Alpha, the words were a compliment, but the tone was a razor's edge. It was a mockery of Vorlag's lack of control. He started toward her. Each step was a hammer blow against Alara's composure. He was going to punish her himself. For her insolence. For speaking out of turn. For existing. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow. Her own scent, the pathetic, rain-washed fragrance of a powerless Omega, soured with fear. His shadow fell over her. She could feel the heat rolling off his body, could smell the pine and storm scent of his power so strongly it made her dizzy. But the blow didn't come. Instead, a large, warm hand closed around her upper arm. The grip was firm, inescapable, but not painful. A jolt, white-hot and blinding, shot through her. It was like lightning striking her soul. The tingling in her scar erupted into a searing fire, a phantom pain and pleasure so intense a gasp tore from her throat. Her eyes flew open, meeting his. In their golden depths, she saw a mirror of her own shock. His nostrils flared, his grip tightening for a fraction of a second. A low, guttural growl ripped from his chest, and it wasn't a warning. It was a sound of pure, possessive confusion. It was the sound of an alpha recognizing something he couldn't possibly be recognizing. Mine. The word wasn't spoken. It was a primal thought that slammed into her mind, not her own, but his. It echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of their connection. And in that single, terrifying moment, Alara knew her life of hiding in the shadows was over. Vorlag surged forward, his face purple with rage. The possessive growl from the Alpha King had been an unforgivable challenge in his own hall. "Take your hand off my property, your majesty," he spat, the honorific dripping with venom. Kale didn't even look at him. His golden eyes were still locked on Alara, searching her face with a frantic, bewildered intensity. The heat from his hand was a brand on her skin, the echo of that impossible connection still thrumming between them. He could feel it too. She knew he could. The half-moon scar on her collarbone was burning, a beacon in the storm of his presence. He glanced down at it, his gaze catching the silvery line peeking from the frayed collar of her tunic. His jaw tightened. "She is no one's property," Kale said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. He finally turned his head, pinning Vorlag with a look that could freeze fire. "And she will be coming with me." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's shock. Go with him. To the Blood Moon Court. It was a death sentence of a different kind. Here, the horrors were familiar. There, they would be unknown. "No," she whispered, the word a pathetic puff of air. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was like steel. "You have no say in this," Vorlag snarled at her, before turning his fury back to Kale. "She is of my pack. My Omega. You have no right." "I have every right," Kale countered, a dangerous smile touching his lips. It held no warmth. The Treaty of the Silver Concord, Article 4, Paragraph 2. Any disputes during a diplomatic summit that threaten the stability of the proceedings grant the visiting Alpha, in this case, the Alpha King, the right to seize the source of the disruption for adjudication in a neutral court. Your inability to control your temper and your servants, he said the word with distaste, is a threat to these proceedings. Therefore, she is the source. And she is now under my protection. It was a masterful, ruthless twisting of the law. Alara's mind reeled. He was using ancient pacts to steal a serving girl. It made no sense. Why? What did he feel in that brief, shocking touch? This is an act of war. Vorlag roared, his own guards shifting, their hands moving toward the hilts of their blades. The king's royal guard, silent shadows until now, materialized around him. They moved as one, a seamless unit of lethal grace. Their scent was of cold steel and unwavering loyalty. The tension in the hall became a physical thing, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Call it what you will," Kale said, his voice bored. He gave Alara's arm a gentle but firm tug, pulling her to her feet and tucking her behind his massive frame. He was a wall of muscle and heat, shielding her from Vorlag's murderous glare. The scent of him was a dizzying cocoon of safety and terror. Attack my guard in your own hall, Vorlag, and not even your ancestors will be able to find the pieces of your pack. The choice is yours. Vorlag trembled with impotent fury. He was outmatched in power, in law, in raw strength. His face was a mask of humiliation. His eyes found Alara's over Kale's shoulder, and they promised a slow, agonizing death if she ever returned. You will regret this, Vorlag hissed. I doubt it, Kale replied dismissively. He kept Alara tucked behind him, his hand still clamped around her arm, and began to walk toward the great doors of the hall. His guard formed a perimeter around them, a moving fortress. The whispers of the Shadowfang pack followed them, a chorus of shock and malice. Alara stumbled along, her legs numb. Her world had been upended in the space of 10 heartbeats. She was being dragged from the only home she'd ever known, a place of pain and servitude, by a man who radiated a power that terrified her as much as it inexplicably called to her. That single word, mine, was still branded on her consciousness. It felt like a claim, a judgment, a prophecy. Once they were clear of the hall and out in the cold, rain-slicked courtyard, Kale didn't slow. He marched them toward a line of waiting carriages, his stride long and purposeful. The night air was a shock of cold against her heated skin. Get her inside, he commanded one of his guards, a stern-faced woman with a scar across her eye. He finally released Alara's arm, and the loss of his heat was so abrupt she swayed on her feet. The skin where he'd held her burned and tingled, the sensation echoing the fire in her collarbone mark. The guard took her arm, her grip professional and impersonal. Come along, girl. Alara looked back at the king. He was staring at his own hand, the one that had held her, with an expression of profound disbelief. He flexed his fingers, then looked at her again, his golden eyes narrowed in a predatory, calculating gaze that made her shiver for an entirely new reason. He wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at a puzzle he was determined to solve, and she was the key. The carriage door closed, plunging her into opulent darkness. She was alone, trembling on velvet cushions that felt more alien than straw bedding. She was a hostage. A prize. A mistake. And as the carriage lurched into motion, carrying her away from the Shadowfang pack forever, she pressed a hand to her collarbone, to the burning, silver crescent. For the first time, the familiar mark felt less like a scar and more like a lock, one that the Alpha King had just inserted a key into. She didn't know what it would unlock, but she was certain it would destroy her. The journey was a blur of velvet darkness, and the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone. Alara huddled in the corner of the carriage, making herself as small as possible, as if she could disappear into the plush upholstery. The fear that had been a sharp spike of adrenaline in the great hall had now settled into a low, gnawing dread. She had traded a familiar cage for a gilded, unknown one. Hours passed. No one came to speak to her. Food and water were passed through a small hatch by a silent guard, but she couldn't bring herself to touch them. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety. What did he want with her? That moment of connection, that impossible jolt of energy, had to be the reason. But what was it? Omegas in her pack were chattel, used and discarded. They didn't have magical connections with Alpha Kings. They didn't have a destiny beyond servitude. The carriage finally rolled to a stop. The door was opened by the same scarred guardswoman. We are here. The king will see you now. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. She stepped out into a vast, torchlit courtyard, the likes of which she'd only seen in her dreams. The Blood Moon Citadel was not a brutish fortress like Vorlag's Keep. It was a spire of elegant, dark stone that clawed at the night sky, radiating an aura of ancient, unshakable power. The air smelled clean, of pine, snow, and wet earth. It was the king's scent, magnified 1,000 times. This was his territory. She was in the heart of the lion's den. She was led not to a dungeon, but up winding staircases and through corridors adorned with tapestries depicting glorious battles and regal wolves. She was taken to a suite of rooms that were larger than the entire servants' dormitory she had left behind. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over a soft bed, a polished wooden table, and a wardrobe. "You will stay here," the guardswoman, whose name she learned was Lyris, informed her. Her tone was not unkind, merely efficient. "There are clothes in the wardrobe. A bath has been drawn. The king will summon you when he is ready." Lyris left, and the sound of a lock clicking into place echoed in the sudden silence. A prisoner in a palace. Elara walked slowly to the bathing chamber, a room of steam and heated marble. The water was scented with lavender. It was an indulgence so profound it felt like a trap. Hesitantly, she shed her threadbare tunic and sank into the heat. As the grime of the Shadowfang kennels washed away, she examined her body. A canvas of faint yellow and purple bruises, old and new. And the scar. High on her collarbone, just where the neck met the shoulder, was the delicate, perfect crescent of a waxing moon. It was no longer burning, but it was still sensitive, the skin pink and tender. She traced its shape, a mystery that had defined her lonely existence. Clean and dressed in a simple, but soft linen shift from the wardrobe, she felt marginally more human. But the fear remained. She was waiting for a summons, for a judgment. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap, listening. The click of the lock came an hour later. Kale entered alone. He filled the doorway, his presence sucking all the air from the room. He had shed his formal diplomatic attire, for a simple black tunic and trousers that did nothing to hide the sheer power of his physique. His gaze swept over her, taking in her clean state, the simple shift, the way she sat poised for flight. "You are unhurt," he stated. It wasn't a question. She swallowed and gave a short, jerky nod. He closed the door behind him and walked slowly toward the fire, not toward her. He was giving her space, a courtesy she had never been afforded by an alpha. It set her on edge more than overt aggression would have. In the hall, he began, his back to her as he stared into the flames. "When I touched you, what did you feel?" Her breath caught. He was addressing it directly. I don't know," she whispered, which was the truth. "A shock. It hurt." He turned his head, his profile sharp and dangerous in the firelight. "It did not feel like pain to me." His voice was a low rumble, laced with a frustration that seemed directed at himself. He ran a hand through his dark hair. "I have spent my entire life aware of this." He tapped a spot on his own chest, mirroring the location of her scar. "A mark. A symbol of a bond one am destined to share. It is the Alpha King's birthright. A connection to my fated mate, my queen." He finally turned to face her fully. "My mark is a crescent moon. For 28 years, it has been a cold, empty brand on my skin. When I touched you, it burned for the first time in my life. It came alive." Elara stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. "Fated mate? Queen? Huh? A nameless, broken Omega servant from a backwater pack. It was impossible. A cruel joke. But it is not right," he continued, taking a step closer. She flinched back. He stopped instantly, a flicker of something, regret. Annoyance, crossing his face. "The bond, it is incomplete. It feels like a half-formed circuit, a song with only every other note. It is there, but it is broken." He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a terrifying mix of hope and suspicion. "You have a mark. I saw it. Show it to me." Her hand flew instinctively to her collarbone, covering the scar. It was hers. The only thing that was truly hers. To show it felt like surrendering the last piece of herself. No, she breathed, shaking her head. Defiance was a foreign, terrifying sensation, but it rose in her now, hot and fierce. Kale's jaw clenched. A low growl started in his chest, the primal alpha instinct warring with his conscious mind. He wanted to stride across the room, tear the fabric of her shift, and see the mark for himself. He wanted to claim what the bond, however fractured, was screaming at him was his. But the terror in her wide, brown eyes held him back. The way she trembled wasn't the quiver of a submissive mate, it was the deep, bone-shaking fear of a victim. And that fact churned his gut with a new, unfamiliar emotion, protective rage. Not for what was his, but for what had been done to her. "I will not harm you," he said, forcing the growl down, keeping his voice even. "I swear on my crown. I am not Vorlag." The use of her former alpha's name was a deliberate blow, and it landed. She winced, her defiance crumbling slightly. He saw the opening and pressed, not with dominance, but with a plea. "Help me understand this. Please." Slowly, hesitantly, her hand trembled and fell away from her collarbone. She lowered the collar of her shift just enough for him to see. There, on her pale skin, was the silver crescent moon. It was a perfect mirror of the shape he knew was emblazoned on his own chest. He took a slow step forward, then another. He stopped an arm's length away, his eyes fixed on the mark. He could feel the energy humming between them, a desperate, incomplete call and response. The air crackled. He had to fight every instinct that screamed at him to touch her, to place his mark over hers and seal the bond. "It's only a scar," she whispered, her voice fragile. "It's always been there." "It is not a scar," he said, his voice thick with a certainty that terrified her. "It is half of a hole." He looked from the mark to her face. "And I don't understand why it is on you." The words were brutal, a dismissal of her worth that was as sharp as any blow from Vorlag. She was not worthy of a king's mark. She knew it. He knew it. And yet, the bond was there. Broken, but undeniably present. He was tethered to this frightened, fragile Omega, and the mystery of it was a maddening obsession. He had to know why. He had to know what the other half of the song was, and where to find it. His twin brother arrived 2 days later. Rhys, the other Alpha King, was a mirror image of Kale in appearance but not in temperament. Where Kale was storm and shadow, Rhys was wind and light. He moved with a relaxed grace, his smile easier, his golden eyes holding a glint of humor rather than Kale's constant, brooding intensity. He was the diplomat to Kale's warrior. He found Kale pacing his study like a caged wolf. "Brother," Rhys said, clapping a hand on Kale's shoulder. "Your message was cryptic. You abduct a serving girl from Vorlag's pack and start a diplomatic incident, all without consulting me. I had to smooth things over with 3 allied alphas on the way here. What, by the moons, is going on?" Kale stopped pacing and faced his twin. The turmoil in him was so great, it was a physical pressure in the room. "The bond," he said, his voice rough. "I felt it." Rhys went still. The easy humor vanished from his face, replaced by stunned silence. The bond of the fated mate was the cornerstone of their dynasty, a legend they had grown up with. "You found her. Where is she? Who is she?" "That's the problem," Kale ground out. He gestured toward the adjoining chambers where Alara was kept. "She's an Omega. A servant from the Shadow Fangs. Broken. Terrified. And the bond, it's wrong." He explained the sensation, the half-formed connection, the incomplete song. "She has the mark, Rhys. A crescent moon, just like ours. But when I touch her, it feels fractured." Rhys frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. "That's not possible. The law is clear. The bond is absolute. One alpha, one mate." He looked at his brother, at the raw frustration etched onto his face. Let me see her. Cale hesitated. A surge of possessiveness, ugly and potent, rose in him. He didn't want Rhys near her. The fractured bond was his problem, his mate, his failure. But Rhys was his twin, his other half in all things. He trusted his judgment above all others. With a curt nod, he led the way. Elara was by the window, staring out at the snow-dusted mountains when they entered. She heard the door and spun around, her body instantly tensing. Seeing Cale was bad enough, but the man beside him, it was like seeing double. Another giant, another predator, identical in every way that mattered. Her breath hitched, and she backed away until her shoulders hit the cold stone of the wall. "This is my brother, Rhys," Cale said, his voice clipped. Rhys's eyes widened as he took her in. He saw not the political pawn Cale had described, but a young woman who looked like a cornered fawn. His gaze was softer than his brother's, tinged with curiosity rather than frustration. He took a step forward. And the world tilted on its axis. The moment Rhys entered her proximity, a new current joined the first. It wasn't the same jolt she'd felt with Cale. It was a different chord, a complementary harmony that resonated on a separate frequency. The crescent mark on her collarbone, which had been a low thrum in Cale's presence, now began to pulse with a steady, rhythmic heat. Rhys stopped dead, his expression morphing from curiosity to utter shock. He clutched his chest, right over his own mark. "Cale." He breathed, his eyes locked on Elara. "What is this?" "I feel it too." Cale's head snapped toward his brother. "What? What do you feel?" "A pull," Rhys said, his voice strained. "It's different from yours, isn't it?" "Quieter." "A resonance, not a demand." He looked back at Elara, his gaze analytical now. "It's like, your bond is the melody, and this." He gestured between himself and Elara, "is the harmony." But they are both playing to an empty room. Suddenly, all three of them cried out. A wave of shared, burning pain erupted from their chests. Elara collapsed against the wall, her hand flying to her collarbone. The mark felt like it was being seared into her flesh all over again. Across the room, Cale and Rhys staggered, both clutching their own chests, their faces masks of agony. On Cale's exposed chest, where his tunic was open at the collar, Elara could see it. A burning, crimson crescent moon. The same mark. The same pain. The agony receded as quickly as it came, leaving them all breathless. A terrifying truth began to dawn in the silent room. The mark wasn't just Cale's. The bond wasn't just for him. It was for both of them. And it was connected, somehow, to her. One omega, marked for two alphas. It was an aberration. A curse. "This is impossible," Cale snarled, his eyes blazing with a dangerous light. He was looking at Elara, as if she were some kind of witch, the source of this cosmic error. But Rhys was looking at her with something else entirely. Not suspicion, but dawning wonder. "Maybe," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the delicate, silver mark against her skin. "Or maybe the law was incomplete." He looked at his brother, then back at Elara. One song, two singers, and a missing instrument. The incident left a fragile, volatile truce in its wake. Cale treated Elara with a grudging, resentful distance, his frustration a constant, simmering presence. He was an alpha king who had been promised a perfect, fated bond, and instead, he was shackled to a riddle wrapped in a terrified omega girl. Rhys, however, took a different approach. He saw not a problem, but a mystery. He began to visit her, bringing her books from the Citadel's library, asking gentle questions about her life with the Shadowfangs. Elara, caught between the twin poles of their power, remained withdrawn. She answered Rhys's questions in monosyllables, never meeting his eyes. Yet, a part of her, a part that had been starved for kindness, slowly began to uncurl. He never tried to touch her. He never raised his voice. He simply was. His presence was a quiet hum to Cale's roaring fire. One afternoon, a week after Rhys's arrival, a commotion erupted in the lower courtyard. Shouts and the snarling of wolves echoed up to her chambers. Peeking from her window, Elara saw two of the royal pack's subordinate alphas locked in a furious dominance struggle. A crowd was gathering, the tension escalating, the air thick with aggression. Suddenly, a wave of nausea and panic washed over Elara. It wasn't her own. It was a shared feeling, a bleed-through from the agitated pack below. The intensity of it made her dizzy, her own scent turning sharp with distress. Without thinking, she pressed her hands to the cold windowpane, her eyes squeezed shut, and wished for it to stop. She focused on the memory of the one peaceful place she'd ever known, a hidden creek in the woods behind Vorlag's keep, the sound of water over stones, the scent of damp earth. She poured all her desperate longing for quiet, for peace, into that mental image. A strange, low hum vibrated from her chest. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a wave of pure tranquility that washed out from her, through the stone of the citadel. Down below, the two snarling alphas faltered. Their hackles lowered, their growls dying in their throats. They looked at each other, dazed, the bloodlust draining from their eyes. The tension in the crowd dissipated like mist. The wolves shook their heads as if waking from a bad dream, then backed away from each other with confused, sheepish glances. From a balcony overlooking the courtyard, Cale and Rhys watched, stunned. They had been on their way to break up the fight, when the wave of calm had washed over them. It was unmistakable, an Omega's soothing aura, but its power was staggering. It had pacified two enraged alphas from 100 yards away. Cale's eyes shot up toward the tower where he knew Elara was. "Did you feel that?" he demanded of his brother. Rhys was already staring at the same window. "An Omega's pacifying gift," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "But on a scale I've never even read about. That wasn't just soothing, it was compelling." They found her slumped against the wall beneath the window, pale and trembling, her energy completely spent. The effort had drained her. Cale rushed to her side, his earlier frustration momentarily forgotten, replaced by a primal concern. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her shoulder, afraid to touch her, afraid of the jolt. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I didn't. I don't know," she stammered, exhausted. "They were fighting. It was so loud, inside my head. I just wanted it to be quiet." Rhys knelt on her other side. "Elara," he said gently, using her name for the first time. "I think you have a gift you don't understand. A very powerful one." The incident became a turning point. Cale's suspicion began to curdle into a grudging respect. No ordinary, broken Omega could possess such power. She was something more. They moved her from her gilded cage to a more comfortable suite of rooms, near their own. Lyris, the guardswoman, was assigned as her personal protector and companion. The pretense of her being a prisoner was dropped. She was now a guest. A very important, very confusing guest. The brothers began a frantic search through the royal archives, delving into ancient texts and prophecies about Omega lineages and unique bondings. They were looking for an explanation, for any precedent that could explain a shared, fractured bond, and an Omega with the power to command peace. As the days turned into weeks, Elara slowly began to heal under the tentative safety of the citadel. With Rhys's quiet encouragement and Lyris's steady presence, she started speaking in full sentences. She started eating regular meals. The constant flinch began to recede. But her nights were plagued by dreams. Not of Vorlag, but of something else. A flash of a girl's face, identical to her own, laughing in a field of wildflowers. A shared memory of a lullaby sung by a woman with kind eyes. A feeling of a small hand clasped in hers. She would wake up with a profound sense of loss, a phantom ache for a person she had never met. She told Rhys about the dreams. He listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "A face like your own," he prompted. "Elara, have you ever heard of another Omega in your pack who looked like you?" She shook her head. "I was the only one." That night, a scout arrived, breathless and bleeding, bearing a message for the kings. Vorlag, humiliated and furious, had been rallying support from rogue northern packs. He was spreading a rumor that the Blood Moon Kings had stolen a sacred Omega, a key to an ancient power, and were hoarding her for themselves. He was twisting the truth into a call to arms. An army was massing at the edge of their territory. And their goal was not war. It was a retrieval. They were coming for Elara. The news sent a chill through the citadel. Kael immediately went into Warrior King mode, dispatching patrols and reinforcing the border. The peace of their lands was threatened. But for the first time, his motivation was not just about protecting his kingdom. When he looked at Elara, who had grown pale at the news, a ferocious, undeniable protectiveness surged through him. Vorlag would not touch her again. He would burn the world to ashes first. That evening, he found her in the library, staring at a page in a book Rhys had given her, her hands trembling. He came to stand beside her, closer than he had since that first day. She didn't flinch away. "He won't get to you," Kael said, his voice a low vow. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide and filled with a fear that was now mixed with a fragile trust. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you protecting me?" He looked down at her, at the woman who was slowly emerging from the shell of the broken servant. He saw her nascent power, her quiet strength, the impossible pull of their shared, broken bond. The answer was complex, tangled with duty, destiny, and a burgeoning feeling he was terrified to name. "Because," he said, the word rough with emotion he couldn't hide. "Whether it is broken or not, whether it makes sense or not, the bond chose you. And my blood, my soul, will not allow me to do anything else." He finally gave into the desperate need he'd been fighting for weeks. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, but the jolt was still there. A shock of warmth, of belonging, of rightness. But it was still incomplete. A promise of a symphony she could only half hear. And in his eyes, she saw the same longing, the same maddening frustration. The bond didn't just connect them, it tortured them with what was missing. And somewhere, out in the world, was the missing piece. The archives yielded a clue. A dusty, leather-bound scroll, written in an archaic dialect, spoke of a prophesied schism. It described twin Omegas born under a dual eclipse, possessing a power so great they could bring an era of unparalleled peace, or utter devastation. Their life force was so immense that it required not one mate, but two, to anchor it, twin alphas of a royal line. The marks would be shared among the four, forming two complete bonds that were also interlinked. To protect this power from those who would misuse it, the law stated the twins would be separated at birth, hidden until their powers began to manifest. One raised in hardship to forge resilience, the other in seclusion to nurture her gift. Kael and Rhys stared at the ancient text, the words blurring before their eyes. Twin Omegas. It was the only explanation. Elara wasn't a mistake, she was one half of a miracle. Her dreams of a girl with her own face were not dreams. They were memories. A sister. Her twin is the missing piece, Rhys breathed, a look of profound revelation on his face. The missing instrument in the song. The bond isn't fractured. It's waiting for the fourth player. The realization slammed into Kael with the force of a physical blow. All his frustration, his resentment toward the incomplete bond, was misdirected. It wasn't Elara's fault. She was as much a victim of this cosmic puzzle as he was. And she had a sister out there somewhere, a sister who held the other half of their shared destiny. A sister who was likely also in danger. Before they could even begin to formulate a plan to find her, the horns on the northern battlements blared a warning. Vorlag had not waited for a formal declaration of war. His forces, bolstered by rogue packs hungry for plunder, were storming the lower pass. The attack had begun. Chaos erupted. Kale and Rhys moved with the chilling efficiency of seasoned rulers at war. Orders were barked, guards dispatched. The citadel, a place of quiet power, transformed into a military fortress preparing for a siege. Lyris found Alara in the library, her face grim. "We have to get you to the sanctuary." But Alara shook her head. The distant shouts and snarls of battle were a terrifying echo of her past, but something new was rising alongside the fear, a fierce, protective instinct. This was her home now. These people, Kale, Rhys, Lyris, had shown her a kindness she'd never known. She would not hide while they fought for her. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "My gift, the calming. I can use it. I can help." The memory of pacifying the alphas in the courtyard was a spark of hope. Kale found them arguing at the door. "She's right," he said, surprising both of them. He looked at Alara, his eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "But you will not go to the walls. You will stay in the central keep, with me. If they breach the gates, your gift may be our last resort to quell the chaos and protect the civilians." It was a strategic decision, but it was also a promise. He was not letting her out of his sight. The battle raged for hours. The sounds of steel on steel, of wolf forms clashing in a brutal dance of tooth and claw, filled the air. Alara stayed with Kale and Rhys in the war room, a helpless observer, as they commanded their forces. The pack bond of the citadel was a maelstrom in her head, a chaotic symphony of pain, rage, and fear. It was agony, but she bore it, knowing it was a fraction of what the fighters were feeling. Then came the shout they all dreaded. "The western gate is breached." Vorlag's forces poured into the lower courtyard. Kale let out a roar of fury, grabbing his blade. "Rhys, hold the command. I am going down there." "No." Alara cried out, grabbing his arm. The touch was electric, a desperate plea. "Don't. It's what he wants. He wants to draw you out." But before Kale could respond, a new sound cut through the din of battle. A high, piercing cry that was not of a wolf, but something else. It was a sound of pure authority, a command that sliced through the rage and bloodlust. It was followed by the appearance of a new force charging into the courtyard, not from the breached gate, but from a hidden postern on the eastern side. They were warriors dressed in grey and silver, moving with disciplined fury, and at their head was a woman. She rode a massive, pale grey wolf, her dark hair flying behind her. She fought with a fluid grace, a silver spear in her hand. And as she turned her head, her face illuminated by the torchlight, Alara gasped. It was the face from her dreams. Identical to her own, but where Alara's held a quiet resilience, this woman's face was fierce, confident, and utterly fearless. At the sight of her, the burning in Alara's mark exploded. Across the room, Kale and Rhys buckled, crying out as their own marks ignited with an intensity that dwarfed anything they had felt before. The bond was no longer a fractured melody. It was a deafening, overwhelming crescendo. The fourth player had entered the stage. "Lyra," Alara whispered, the name coming to her lips unbidden, a memory unlocked from the deepest part of her soul. Her sister. Down in the courtyard, Lyra's head snapped up, her gaze finding the window of the war room, as if drawn by an invisible string. Her eyes, the same warm brown as Alara's, widened in shock as she saw her twin for the first time. In that moment of recognition, a cataclysmic surge of power erupted. It flowed from Alara and Lyra, two halves of a whole, finally reunited. A visible wave of shimmering, silver energy pulsed outwards from the citadel. It wasn't the gentle calm Alara had produced before. This was a tidal wave of absolute, undeniable command. Peace. Every fighting wolf, blood moon and rogue alike, froze mid-snarl. Weapons fell from nerveless hands. The rage, the hate, the bloodlust, it was all scoured away in an instant, replaced by a profound, bewildered tranquility. Vorlag, poised to strike down a blood moon guard, stopped with his blade raised, his face a mask of confusion. The battle was over. Not won, but simply ended. In the stunned silence of the war room, Elara met Cale's gaze. His golden eyes were wide with awe and something deeper, something that looked terrifyingly like love. The bond between them was no longer broken. It was a blazing, complete circuit, humming with power and the promise of a destiny far grander and more terrifying than she could ever have imagined. The song was finally whole. In the silent, snow-dusted courtyard, the four of them finally stood together. Elara and Lyra, hand in hand, a circuit of shared memory and newfound power flowing between them. Cale and Rhys, standing before them, their faces a mixture of awe, relief, and profound recognition. The air hummed, alive with the energy of the completed bond, a complex web of four souls finally aligned. Lyra's protectors, the grey-clad warriors of the Order of the Silent Moon, had secured the courtyard and taken a stunned Vorlag into custody. Lyra explained what the brothers had already begun to suspect. They were the twin Omegas of the prophecy. After their parents, the previous guardians of the gift, were murdered by conspirators seeking to weaponize their power, the twins were separated. Lyra was taken into hiding by the Order to be trained, while Elara was hidden in plain sight, her identity suppressed, left in the care of a supposedly loyal pack, the Shadowfangs. But Vorlag's father had been part of the conspiracy, and when he died, Vorlag inherited the secret, treating Elara as a tool to be kept broken until her power manifested. "He knew what you were," Lyra said, her eyes flashing with anger as she looked at Elara's faint bruises. "He was trying to break your spirit, believing it would make you easier to control when the time came. He failed," Cale stated, his voice a low growl of possessive pride. His gaze was fixed on Elara, on the quiet strength in her eyes that had been there all along. The bond was a dizzying new reality. It wasn't two separate pairs. It was a quad link. Elara felt a primary, blazing connection to Cale, the melody, the fire. But she also felt a steady, harmonious link to Rhys, and a deep, foundational, soul-deep connection to her sister. It was a tapestry, intricate and perfect. Cale and Rhys felt it too, a primary pull to their fated Omega, but also an unbreakable, familial bond to her twin. In the days that followed, the Citadel buzzed with the new reality. Justice for Vorlag was swift. Before a council of alphas summoned by the kings, his crimes were laid bare, not just his abuse of Elara, but his conspiracy against the royal line and the sacred Omega gift. He was stripped of his title and his pack, condemned to the Blackwater mines, a fate worse than death. For Elara, the world had been remade. With Lyra by her side, memories of their early childhood returned in a flood, healing the hollow places inside her. She learned about their power, this incredible gift of pacification that, when combined, could enforce peace on a continental scale. But the most terrifying and wonderful new reality was Cale. The arrogant, frustrated king had been replaced by a man who looked at her with a reverence that made her tremble. The bond screamed at them to complete the mating, to seal the connection with the final claiming bite. But Cale held back. He found her one night on the balcony of her chambers, watching the twin moons rise. He came to stand beside her, not crowding her, his presence a familiar, comforting heat. "The council has affirmed your and Lyra's new status," he said softly. "You are not guests. You are the Omega Queens of this territory, with authority equal to my own and my brother's." Elara absorbed this, her heart fluttering. Queen. It was an impossible title. "I was a servant a month ago," she whispered. "I don't know how to be a queen." "You will learn," he said. "We will rule together." All four of us. He paused, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. The bond is demanding. She knew what he meant. She felt it too, a constant, primal ache for finality she was still afraid of. Kale. He turned to her, his golden eyes pleading. I know what the bond wants. What I want. But that is not enough. After everything you have endured, fate is not enough. It has to be your choice. Not Vorlag's choice for you, not destiny's choice. Yours. He took her hand, his touch gentle. Do you choose this, Elara? Do you choose me? All her life, she had been a piece on a board, moved by others. Vorlag's property. The king's pawn. A prophesied omega. For the first time, she was being offered true agency. He was the most powerful man on the continent, her fated mate, and he was giving her the power to say no. She looked into his eyes and saw past the king, past the alpha, to the man who had seen her value when she was covered in dirt and fear. The man who had used his power not to break her, but to shield her. The man who was learning that true partnership was not about dominance, but about respect. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, the first genuine, joyful smile she had perhaps ever known. It transformed her. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. I choose you. The word was a release. He let out a shaky breath and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His scent, pine and storm, enveloped her, no longer terrifying, but the scent of home. He held her not with the force of a king claiming his prize, but with the tenderness of a man embracing his whole world. He tilted her head back, his gaze searching hers one last time for any hint of doubt. Finding none, he lowered his head and finally kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of conquest, but of homecoming. It was the closing chord of a song that had been waiting lifetimes to be sung, a promise of a new beginning, chosen freely, under the light of the twin moons. The broken servant was gone. In her place, a queen had risen.